Far side, right? Okay. Thank you. Hello. Hey, how y'all doing?
Good afternoon. Welcome to the FDR Presidential Library Museum, and on such a beautiful afternoon, it's nice to see everyone out here and nice to be able to host you and host our friend and our guest, Basil Smikle. And I'll just jump right into the, actually, I want to also thank the Poughkeepsie Public Library. That's very important, and to be, absolutely. To be able to do this and in partnership with them and their Big Read program, where for a month they're going to have a really rich series of programs recognizing 60 years of the Civil Rights Act. And of course, that's the theme around which we'll have our discussion today. And, you know, we support and really believe, like we all do here in this room, in the work of the public libraries and to the good work Tom is doing too with the library. So thanks very much. We sure appreciate it. So I don't need to do a lot of introduction. Basil is accepted immediately for a program with us. You've been very supportive here at the library, and you've changed positions in the past year. You've moved over from your policy position at Roosevelt House over to Columbia University. What's the program there?
I am professor and director of the nonprofit management program at the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University. That's all on one card.
That's as good as a government title, you know. That's a long one. So, we want to talk today about several things in relation to not only the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but how we get to those acts. What that continuum of history is. These things don't just happen in vacuums, but specific moments do arise that enable things to occur. And then the policy questions that are the policy that has been developed, or the questions that have led to policy, and then what that interaction is. So let's jump into it.
Okay.
You work in a policy space.
Yep.
How much, when you're thinking in terms of policy, or when you're communicating with your students or with young people in the political system, or candidates for that matter, how does history, how does that context play into what those conversations are?
Context is, to most of us, context is extremely important. Right? History is important. You know, if you're the half political scientist in me will talk about path dependence and positive feedback loops, which all that terminology just means is that history matters. History matters in how you view the present, because you know, this is sometimes something we talk about with respect to identity politics. A lot of people, you know, don't particularly care for identity politics in many ways because it's the connotation is that, you know, it's minority politics. But the reality is we engage in identity politics all the time. If you're a lawyer, a doctor, if you're a veteran, if you're a farmer, if you're Black, if you're LGBTQ, you know, you see the world through those experiences. And the constituencies associated with those experiences have history. We didn't just get here. I didn't just show up. Right? All of these constituencies have history, and in understanding the past, it's supposed to keep you from repeating it. And
that's kind of what we hope.
We're just going to keep going because we can
go a long way on that one. So let's
right. We'll just keep going. You're supposed to learn enough to not repeat it, but also be able to embrace all of the good, all of the memories, all of the people, and understanding what individuals had gone through and groups have gone through, so that it can help inform the decision you make today. Now, as you talk about young people, one of the biggest challenges that I have, and there were some folks who recognize me from TV. Thank you very much. I thank you. My mama would be proud. So thank you very much. She paid for the braces, which is why I have to smile. But none of my students watch me on TV. None of them, because they don't watch TV. And trying to, and I realize that the more that I teach, the greater the age gap. So my pop culture references don't work anymore. So I say, well, you remember MASH? What's MASH? All in the but here's an interesting point that I raise around that specific example. If I remember correctly, the finale of MASH had 87 million viewers or something to that effect. It's the most watched TV show in history. Why? Because we all got together at a very specific time in the day or in the evening and watched the show, because that was the only time it was going to be shown, right? If you missed it, that was it, right? Young people don't have that today. They can curate all of their entertainment, all of their news, and it is right in the palm of their hand. And there is no sitting around a television with family members or friends to watch. They may share what's on their phone, but there isn't that same sense of community. They have it, but not in the ways that even I had it. I'm 52, and so even generations. I'm a Gen Xer, so even generations older than me, it's just very different. So in trying to explain that history matters and context matters, it's trying to, particularly for young people, it's trying to find a way to kind of intersect that feed that's curated and algorithm specific. It's trying to find a way to kind of get in the middle of that and say, stop the flow. Let me tell you or talk to you about why that's important, why that might not be true, and why, if you apply a little bit of wisdom, you may think differently. But that's hard to do in a classroom. That's really difficult to do, when you're door knocking. It's very difficult to do on the street, but it has to be done because history matters. And when I talked about positive feedback loops, there are things that we do politically, policy-wise, that actually work, even though a lot of folks don't think government works. Government can actually work sometimes. Things actually do work sometimes.
They do.
And when we look at the things that work, why it worked, evaluating that, right, and then applying it forward, we can say, okay, that worked. Maybe we can make this better. Maybe we don't need it anymore because we found something else. But all of these things kind of come into play when you have leaders that are very focused on being active leaders. And when you're talking to young people about government and bureaucracy and politics and the connection to electoral politics to policy making. If I remember the Federalist Papers correctly, because I read those just. There's a point where in talking about Congress, it's written that the goal of choosing a member of Congress was that that person would be able to take their community's wishes and desires and distill them using wisdom into a positive outcome. And that's, to me, that's kind of my guiding philosophy in the work. How can I capture everybody's interests and cares and concerns, distill them into something with wisdom, to the extent that I have it at 52, but the gray beard suggests I did, and then push that into good policy making.
So, coming back to then the context, I find this fascinating in the sense of there are moments too that you're reacting to, that you want people to appreciate the context. You want wisdom to be shared so that people realize over time they grow and they change and they see bigger pictures. But then there are moments that can be seized too to help in a very sort of explicit moment in
Yep.
time
Yep.
impact change? And then how when you're thinking about policy or the developing ways forward, do you seize those moments? Of course, in thinking about the Civil Rights Act, but in going back further to certain moments in history, and really even to the Voting Rights Act of '65, there were these moments in time, the assassination of President Kennedy, the Pettus Bridge in Selma, that galvanized people, and those political leaders were smart enough or savvy enough to utilize those moments to
No.
advance causes. That's all a very long question. Do you, how do you help create a nimbleness, let's say, in
Yeah.
people and their thinking so that they recognize those moments where you can make change?
Yeah, it's interesting because the two ways that I think about that. One, when Francis Perkins came to FDR and said, I will work with you only if I can help with old age insurance, which became Social Security. Right? I always say that policies create constituencies. Now that you have Social Security for a group of people defined in a certain way, those individuals now are a constituency that you have to talk to, that you have to engage, because now you have created something that can benefit them. And if you try to take it away, no, right? Absolutely not. And so in some ways, the thinking about policy, the urgent, the need to step in and have dialogue around the benefits and downsides, in many ways are the constituency that is engaged in that is created by the policy itself sometimes. But there's also something that we talk about called shared fate. Sometimes that's by geography, sometimes that's by race or ethnicity. And this greater sense that we have to keep moving to this notion of progress that in and of itself can be defined differently over time. And, when I think about, and you see this, I always think about the Tuskegee Airmen and how they, in fighting abroad, they saw the American flag, they'd say, I'm home, I'm safe. But when they got home, treated like half a man. Now, when I think about that, I use it as an example because I would say to myself, there's a point where those men and their families and their children will say, not my children, we're not going to do this again. We're going to keep going back to what I said before. We're going to keep moving forward. Into the military becomes integrated, right? And next thing you know, we have a Colin Powell to look and say, right? Because there's this sense that we have to keep moving forward. That status is death. Status is going backwards by definition. And I also think about, which then brings me to the next point, it's both a sense of constant urgency and non-passivity. So one of the things that the Civil Rights exhibit really shows, and I love the way that this comes out.
Here at the library.
Yes, I'm sorry. Here at the library.
Here at the library.
At the library, yes. One of the things that's wonderful about the Civil Rights exhibit is that it shows that there is a group of African-American men and women who understand and are very mindful of the guidelines and the rules and the politics and the constraints within which they have to work. But they are not at all passive about wanting to see a different future for themselves and their families. So they keep going. And they keep going, right? If we don't get it through this president, we're going to get it through the next. We can't get it through Congress here, we're going to go to the next Congress, right? It's the constant movement. And I think that is probably the biggest way, the best way I can answer the question in terms of how do you step into the moment and engage that urgency is the constant motion, right? We have to keep moving. We have to keep pushing forward. And if you think about the earlier point about policies creating constituencies, they also create conversations. Coming out of the Civil Rights Act 64 was in the education circles, we talk, it's known, this thing called the Coleman Report. Does anybody know the Coleman Report? It's 1966 it comes out. Coleman, there's a study that the Civil Rights Act essentially commissions. Biggest one of its kind at the time, 600,000 surveys to determine for the first time what's happening in our schools. Because there really isn't at that time a really good sense of what happens in schools, what we should be measuring, and the impact of reform, including the dollars spent on schools. And what's interesting is what comes out of this is this really fascinating, but also controversial, and to some of us in the room, maybe not so groundbreaking today, but in 1966 this was, that the money doesn't matter. How much you put into the schools doesn't really matter to the child's achievement. What matters most is what's happening at home. What kind of environment is that child living in? Is that child, is the parent reading to that child at home, right? Is that child living in poverty? And how does that affect what they eat, how often they eat, if they're eating, things like that. So why is that critical? It's critical because, number one, in and of itself is a groundbreaking study. But what does it do? It starts to grow all of this activity on the ground, where some people are saying, yeah, now we need to focus on the families and what's at home, what's happening at home. And there are other folks that are saying, well, maybe we should not focus so much on racial integration, but class integration. And maybe that can alleviate some of the problems or the differences in home life for these kids, which then sparks another set of conversations around, well, why is it that my Black children have to go to a white school? Why is other better? Why can't my kids just learn in my neighborhood? Now you're going back to resources. So what I often look at when I try to think about what's happening in this moment and the ability for communities and constituencies to make sense of it and to figure out how to move forward. Some of it is reactionary, as like what happened after this report and all of this dialogue and conversation that came around that. But it's also about making sure that there is constant movement, that there is this search for or desire for progress, and we just have to keep going forward.
And then we're back to a question of the context and continuum too, because how do you then help young people, and I'm going to sound very old at 57, and as a gay man who has no children, but who still thinks of himself as 14, how do you engage with young people in a way that it doesn't seem like anything's happened at all? Why are we having to have this conversation again? Why didn't people before us do more? Or why didn't they do it,
Well,
do what they did?
There's an interesting challenge right now, because given all that I've said, there's one sort of thread through all of it, that even if we don't think the institutions are fair, as long as we have the right people running it, we'll be in better shape. There are a lot of young people today that do not believe that. They do not trust the institutions at all and feel we just need to scrap it and start over. I had this, I went to Cornell undergrad, and we marched against apartheid. The anti-apartheid movement was the sort of movement of my youth, right? So we marched. May have taken over a building here and there. All right. Well, I'm from the Bronx, so there's probably a subway train with my little graffiti scrawled on it somewhere. Well, can I say that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a federal facility here. Just keep that in mind.
All right. That's city. That's but that said, look, I understand and I've had my moment where I've been active and an activist in many ways. And I'm different in that now, but in those days, yeah, we marched, we did all those things. But ultimately, I felt that the work that I did, the marches that I attended, the ways that I was educating myself about what was going on in the world. You should remember, Bill Clinton was my first presidential vote in 1992. When he wins, a lot of the folks he took with him came from the Jesse Jackson Rainbow Coalition. As a child, as a teenager, I'm seeing Jesse on TV at the DNC saying, yeah, I'm a Democrat, but the party's not doing enough for people like me and poor people, and it's this Rainbow Coalition. And that mattered to me. That impacted me as a child. My parents were, not terribly political, but in many ways, they thought a lot about geopolitics. A relative of mine was a co-founder of Marcus Garvey's UNIA, Thomas Smikle, back in the day. So that was always part of my thinking. I'm a Garveyite, if you will. But I felt that once I saw Bill Clinton get into office, and then there were all these women in the circle, right, that were running things. You had African Americans like the Secretary Alexis Herman, Rodney Slater, who was over at transportation. His political director, Mignon Moore, is African American woman, and I was like, okay. But remember, 40 years before that, David Dinkins becomes the first Black mayor of the city of New York. Mm-hmm. And I remember on the news ribbon, because we didn't have internet in those days, in the news ribbon at the student union, it said David Dinkins becomes first Black mayor of the city of New York. And me and my friend Andy Velez were walking into the student union, and we looked at each other, and he said to me, look what we did. We didn't even vote for him. So what's the we? But what's the we? The we is this collective community where we were all thinking, believing that the work that we were doing was for something. And that is the thing. He gets elected, becomes the first Black mayor. So what ends up happening is we grow up believing that our direct political activity, like not partisan, but political activity, our civic engagement, let me say it that way. Our civic engagement has a direct impact on the outcomes that we were looking for. I do not think that a lot of young people feel that way about their institutions. They are civically engaged. They are. And I do not want anyone to come away believing that I don't believe that they are. They are in a different way than perhaps I was, but they are civically engaged. But what they don't believe generally is they don't have the same faith in institutions that I have. And so the challenge is trying to, and this is, anybody that's heard me talk lately recognize this is the challenge, one of the challenges we face today. How do you convince a young person that they should vote for someone who will help them and improve their lives because of the reform, but they come from the very institution they don't trust? Mm-hmm. I have not figured out how to do that.
Well, if you do, you would not.
Well, I would
hope you wouldn't be sitting here, but would be
getting a Nobel Prize.
Exactly.
Right? Something.
Well, sitting here as the director of an institution, and an institution with a man's name on it, an important historical figure, but nevertheless, here you have an institution that is seemingly about one person. So how that you translate that into, the institution actually is a reflective of you and experience, broader experience than that one person. The one person's important, essential as part of this. I mean, obviously that's why it's here, but that the story's always more complex, and actually it always, the word inclusive is used so wrong, and it's just becomes sort of an easy word to throw out there to suggest that someone's doing something, but that the stories are in fact there over in our building and in that exhibit, as you referenced. Yeah. So it's that dialogue, that engagement, that again, if I could figure this out, I would win some Nobel Prize if they have one in business, which I don't think they do, thankfully. The organization then just grows and changes depending on how you bring people in and how they see their place within it. Is policy development the same way? I mean, the fact that people have to be engaged in that in order for it to be reflective ultimately, or it's just a weapon or a tool against them.
Well, in many ways, the goal of institutions, individuals that are engaged in civil society, is to get more people to overcome what we call the free rider problem, right? We need you to be engaged so that the work of so that your lives are not governed by the work of very, very few people. Right? The more people that can be involved, the idea is the better for everybody else, right? Because then it'll be more of a collective decision making. And that's what's become really difficult today. That we see how so very few people are generating so much content that we consume and make decisions about. And what's also becoming difficult is determining how much of that is true, how much of it is real. I said the other day that I'm not terribly active on Twitter. I'm getting better at it. But all of a sudden, I'm seeing all of this content that I didn't see before. And I'm saying, how is that happening? My habits haven't changed, so something's changed. I don't know if somebody's got their foot on the pedal somewhere or somebody in a room somewhere saying, oh, send this to him, send this to him. I don't know. I don't know. But something's changed. Now, if I were not the kind of person who researched for a living and would check sources and triangulate my research, right? I would be more of a captive to that information than perhaps I should be. And so what scares me is the consolidation of the entities that generate the content that we consistently see.
It's interesting. I mean, obviously, we're here at this library. We're in archives, which is fundamentally, and it is the evidence. And the sort of now, which are becoming more quaint, but is so central to it, is that the provenance of that unbroken chain of custody, that's a trusted source. And that certain institutions were trusted sources, and that we certainly feel that on a daily basis. The notion of the information that's out there or provided, or that is generated towards people, whether it's accurate or not, whether it has validity or absolutely doesn't. The source of that, or the understanding of it, is largely, it's either invisible or non-existent. And so then the moments that may be taken advantage of to affect change that would have been played out on television in the evening news, say in 1965, where you would have seen the same thing. Everyone would have seen the same thing, or the cover of major newspapers. Right. Now that's not there at all. Nope. And in fact, quite the opposite could occur. Something wholly made up out of cloth becomes the moment that seems real to people. As someone like you who engages with students, but on a graduate level, and well, I suppose undergraduate too, where you're actually having conversations, trying to move things forward, and trying to have that dialogue. Is the idea, if there's no trust in the system, then what comes in its place? It's fine to want to tear something down, I always say, but what do you want then in its place?
I wish I could answer that.
That's an easy question.
Easy question. It's so simple. I wish I could answer that for them. I think it's just a wholesale throwing out of what we have and starting from scratch. It seems like we've moved to a place, and it was always sort of present in our world and in our life, but I think even more so now, that it's more of the culture of personality, right, that drives, and not the kind of understanding of history and the evidence-based policy making and so on that I was raised to, regardless of political party, I was raised to practice. just a funny story. I'm writing a book now, and I interviewed a former elected official who was telling me that he was a former elected in Brooklyn, African American, was telling me that when he went to college at Wilberforce in Ohio, he joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And one of the people that he met was, and it really inspired him, was a guy named Cleve Sellers, who was in SNCC and an organizer and so on and so forth. And then trying to figure out, well, who is this guy, Cleve Sellers? And it turns out it's the father of Bakari Sellers, who's on CNN, right? And one of the things, I love that. I love that. My head exploded. I love that, right? Because I loved following the path, right? History matters, right? Here, if you look at Bakari now I understand more of his thinking because now I know a little bit about his dad. And now I understand that former elected official and understand why the things that he was doing in his community, where it came from. So I love the connectivity of that.
Yeah.
But that requires some time.
Well,
It's an effort and a desire to want to make those kinds of connections. Now, again, that's not to say that a lot of people, particularly young people or my students, don't want to do that. But what I'm saying is that it just becomes harder when it's almost like we just don't have this sort of the common threads that we used to have, or it doesn't feel like that anymore. It's funny. I went up to Cornell to speak some years ago. I think you heard me tell this story. And I had 4 hours to kill. So what do you do when you have 4 hours to kill in Ithaca, New York? You get a tattoo. So I was getting a tattoo. And I generally don't tell people what I did. I wasn't on TV as much as I am now. So I didn't really have a basis to talk to him about that. But I was actually up there speaking something related to the party that I used to be head of. And I just asked him, where do you get your news? I ask a lot of people that. Where do you get your news? Bless you. And he said, YouTube. And I was like, okay. And then I asked him, what are you watching? And he tells me who he listens to. And I said, but they just keep sending you down, with this algorithm, you're going to see the same kinds of things. And we went back and forth. It was actually a really fascinating conversation, really good conversation. He did a good job, by the way, on the actual artwork. I was just going to say, as we're having this really intense conversation about, TV watching and who he likes, who he doesn't like. But he swears that the people he's watching are telling him truth. Mm-hmm. How do I get in the middle of that, right? Because he doesn't need to sit in one place at 7:30 or 6:30 at night and we're all watching Lester Holt, It's like that's not him. That's not how it works anymore for a whole other generation. They carry something about this size and just all day. And I don't bemoan the ability for technology to give people information, but how do you ascertain, how do you pull wisdom out of that?
Yeah.
How does wisdom apply? And a sense of history.
And how can you build opportunities for sort of an authenticity of experience so that it isn't that you get people out of that for experiences that are real.
And I'll tell you, let's talk about also the connection to policy and to political movements. There have been some really interesting articles, one in The Economist, and there was another one, I want to say it was the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, on the growing isolation of young men. A lot of it related to social media. But, there are a lot of young men right now that in their 30s still living at home, not as gainfully employed as maybe a generation earlier. And then there's a growing isolation there. And I don't think we've done much to solve that or to address that. That has become more concerning, particularly with African-American men. We're seeing some of that play itself out politically on the national stage right now. But what's happened is it allows people to be in those silos and to stay in those silos. And I'll just say, if you watched it, Barack Obama was talking about this at the convention the other day, that there is this growing isolation that people are feeling. And it is becoming really difficult to break folks out of that and to insert yourself into these folks' lives when they can just sort of stay in this space. Now, on the one hand, what technology has done is small d democratize movements. And I was part of a panel that a couple of the major Black churches in New York City organized after George Floyd was killed. And one of the questions, the whole panel was organized because they were wondering, what is the future of the Black church? If you're from or visit Harlem, a lot of those churches that I knew even 10, 20 years ago have closed. The church that Malcolm X was funeralized in has been closed down. And they were supposed to build affordable housing and it never got built. So it's a big hole in the ground. But church after church after church is closing.
Churches are institutions too, aren't they?
Institutions too. And religiosity has gone down. So what that panel was doing was asking the question, what is our sense of community today? Where do we go to find out what's going on? Where do we go to get our literal marching orders to be able to go out and engage in these protests? Now, that's not to say they don't exist, but what it is saying is that when you have a generation that doesn't necessarily trust the institutions, then either the institutions are going to change or they're going to create their own. And in some ways, in that virtual space, they have done that and have created movements out of that. So when you look at what, the protests, the Black Lives Matter, all those protests after George Floyd, that wasn't organized in a specific space. That was all a lot of online social media engagement where people say, meet me this place, this time, here we go. Let's go, right? And on the one hand, you love to see that. You love young people being able to say, I'm not going to wait for you to tell me what to do. I'm just going to go do it. But on the other hand, there are other institutions that exist that if you're going to engage in this kind of civic activity, what then are you trying to build to add to these institutions to make them stronger and more responsive? And some of them will say, well, the institution just doesn't matter anymore, or it should be knocked down. And I'll just say this very quickly. I teach a class at Columbia on police reform that came out of actually the George Floyd killing. And there were so many students that initially had said, we want to defund the police, because that's kind of how the class came about. Again, an institution of sorts, right? Apostasy of sorts. And when they leave the class, my goal is not to disabuse them of that notion. My goal is to offer what happens if you do, or also, what is the world like if that happens? And what if you didn't defund it, what would you do to reform it? And how does that bet? And they leave the class saying that they were more confused about how to move forward than when they started the class. And I said, that's my point, right? Because the goal is to keep thinking about it, that there isn't a set answer. And if you understand that there are communities that you have to bring together to really talk about this and talk about what happens, you'll understand that it's not as easy as you think it is. And let's just also add to this the institutions themselves and the differences from state to state. And so I'm saying this, I'm giving you this example because it's important to understand both institutions and how we feel about them, but also how our country is built and why that matters to our policymaking. There are over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country, right? There are over 14,000 school districts in this country, 18,000 law enforcement agencies. So when a student says, well, we should have police officers that, have college degrees. Well, all right, or college credit. Well, in New York City they do that, but there are a lot of parts around the country where you don't need any college experience. You could just be a high school graduate and be a police officer. Well, then maybe we should, at least if they have college experience, we should teach them, or even if not, we should teach them diversity training in the academy. A lot of police officers will say, that couple of weeks in the police academy when they learn diversity training, they're kind of a fully formed adult at that point. So do they really have an opportunity to internalize it, or are they just studying it, which is different?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Well, maybe we should teach them in kindergarten, in K-12 education about diversity. So, well, if you live in Florida, that might be a challenge. Or any other state, right? Because now you're basing what that police officer is learning based on where they live. And there could be 50 different ways in addition to the 14,000 school districts. And then they get to one of 18,000 law enforcement agencies. How do you take that one policy of trying to reform police and nationalize it? Our country just doesn't really work that way, right? So the point being that you trying to push all of this information into a conversation around why policy should change, who's going to change it, and your role in helping make that change is a really long conversation actually that you need to have, which a lot of folks don't want to have. And if you're, I always talk about it, like if my mother was a school teacher for 30 years, she was a proud UFT member, and she thankfully had a lot of books at home and would take the time to really talk to me every day. Not every parent has that opportunity. There are a lot of folks today, and I always tell my students, you're no longer the average voter because you're coming to class to learn about this stuff. There's a train operator who's got a lunch break in 15-minute breaks a day. That's been bargained into their contract. I don't know how much news that person has the ability to consume every day. It is up to us in some ways to help move that conversation along. And it's difficult.
Well, on the point that it's difficult, we'll open up to some questions, and then we'll close after some questions on the hopefulness of what can be accomplished.
Oh, I am hopeful.
I know you are. That's the
sound like
thing.
I'm
I
not
know you
hopeful. I am
are.
hopeful.
We wouldn't be engaged in the work, would
Sure.
we? Even and because these institutions aren't just monoliths, they are actually like people in offices
There are
and
people,
engaged.
And I know you have a question coming, but I will say all institutions are not buildings. They're people. They're people and rules. They're people and
lots
rules.
of rules. True.
Lots of rules
True.
and lots of laws. And there are ways you can influence people and impact people.
From Facebook. And I'd like to also say thank you and welcome to everyone who's participating in this virtually, which again is reaching far more than this library ever did before the pandemic, which is a wonderful thing. Great program. Thank you. In terms of foundation of a movement, what do you think Eleanor Roosevelt's greatest contribution to civil rights was? That's a big question.
It is a big question. Actually, I was thinking about this not long ago because I was talking to, in the class in education policy that I teach, we start with the New Deal, actually. And we talk about a lot of what's in the exhibit, that despite best intentions, there were a lot of chairs of very important committees that wouldn't allow the passage of legislation if it were to benefit African Americans. So you see, starting then, systematically, African Americans being left out of the GI Bill. It's a whole host of the New Deal policies, which in many ways has created the wealth disparity that we see to this day. But with respect to institutions, if you think about President Roosevelt's responsibility as President of the United States, what could he do? He could appoint Supreme Court justices, and those Supreme Court justices went on to vote unanimously for Brown versus Board of Ed, right? But that's part of his power. And in many ways, from a lot of what we read, and thank you, we got to read some amazing letters when I first came here, and it really did highlight for me how much Eleanor played a role in sort of doing the behind the scenes stuff, the backdoor stuff, as you know, because there's a whole lot of political engagement that happens, the sort of submerged government. I won't even call it that. It is sort of how you have a lot of these backdoor conversations, all of that stuff that can happen away from the public's view, but with the kind of autonomy, but also authority to be able to work with leaders and talk to the clergy. You know, there's a woman in Harlem that I've come to know, she's an older woman who she has pictures of her grandfather with Eleanor Roosevelt in the Harlem apartment building, because you know there was this intentionality around meeting people and engaging them. And to me, you know, most people will never meet the president of the United States, but she wanted to make sure that folks met her.
And that I like how you phrase that about it. It is political.
Yeah.
That's political work on its most grassroots level in some ways, but even higher, like you say, there's authority there. And we're talking about that a lot here at the library in terms of Eleanor Roosevelt's political activity and expanding the base of the party. And bringing more people and working through what her platform was to bring more people into to the party to have to play a part in it.
I mean, there's a great photo. With Mary McLeod Bethune, and there's, you know, just as you said, the expansion of and the grassroots work of party business, party politics. It is the going out and meeting people. It's the going to the homes. It's the knocking on doors. And in those days, clearly, it's the writing of the letters, right? Back and forth. And there's a letter that I got to see where, you know, she's asking the campaign, are you doing this? Are you doing that? Are you, you know, chapter and verse, say, like, what's going on here? And that is extraordinary because when you look, she's the best surrogate he could ever have. But in some ways, she is a principal also, right?
Yes,
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
And she is, she's building connections. She's advancing
She's
causes.
building the coalition.
That's right.
She's building a coalition. And it's important to note that it's happening in ways that as president, he could not do. And I love that. I love that work. And I love knowing that was happening, right? Because again, politics is not, not partisanship, but politics is not, it's not static. It's always moving and always morphing.
And having that access and gaining those connections and
could you imagine?
And working that. I mean, that's why it's easy. And I think about our conversation with young people. It is easy to look and say, I don't understand why they didn't do X, or they could have done so much more. And sometimes people could have. I mean, let's be real, people could have.
And you know, and
yet,
no. And what's interesting is because people could do more. They want to do more, but to a question you had earlier, sometimes it's all about the timing.
It's
all about timing. So what's interesting is what ends up happening, right? The New Deal is very focused on cash to financial support to Americans at the time because they're cash poor, right? But fast forward a number of years, Kennedy is assassinated, LBJ takes office. Now, he recognizes that the country is not in a place where politically there's any stomach for cash support to individuals. He's very clear on trying to advance Kennedy's mission in some ways and view of civil rights. So he says, all right, we're going to have this great society, right? So it's not the cash to Americans, but it is cash through federal government to the states through and into local communities. Title I, for example, the Head Start program, all of that, this explosion of opportunity that's not as tied to race as it is to class, but the notion was that it would sort of pull up everyone, right? And this explosion of programs that were, that in some ways continued the New Deal, but to the extent that it could correct some of the problems with it of not being able to support African Americans directly, the idea was they're going to do that too. right? And so you have the Bilingual Education Act, ESEA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Bill, like all of this taking place at around the same amount of time, all in many ways because you've had a New Deal that showed what was possible when you expand government and make it responsive to the people. You have a push for integration that happened because of Brown versus Board of Ed. That occurred because FDR put those Supremes on that court, right?
And because the NAACP had established its legal defense fund, the activism that's moving up through the courts.
Absolutely right. So you have all this civic engagement through the NAACP and other organizations, the Urban League. You have Eugene Kinkle-Jones, who's talked about in the exhibit. All of these individuals that are never passive and are always saying, we're going to move this needle forward. And a moment comes and says, we have the president, we have the movement, to some extent, we have the courts. Let's make this work. And they get it done.
And still working within the same, in many ways, the same sort of political environment where certain parts of a party have an outsized level of control over, still working within that, but with changed circumstances and with, frankly, some dramatic events which help set a stage to then all of that 40 years and longer work.
I mean, you take every president that comes into office, if that president has both houses of the House and Senate, they're like, all right, what do we got? You got 2 years, let's get it done, right?
And that's assuming everyone in that party agrees.
And that's assuming everyone
which is, as we know, not often the case. Questions? Other questions?
None at all.
Now, wow.
Wow.
We'll just keep
going. All
going.
the way back.
So way back there.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm wondering, I was a member of the counterculture back in the 60s and 70s, and we were, again, similar to what you discussed about young people today, fed up with institutions, had no faith in institutions, and we're committed to creating our own. And I guess I've felt that a lot of the civic engagement that eventually grew out of that came out of that impulse, of that very empowering impulse to create communities, to create organizations, to create communes, all different kinds of things, some of which, of course, failed, but many of which, in my experience, have led people to pursue really different paths in life and made contributions that they otherwise maybe wouldn't have. So I'm wondering, do you ever talk to your students about prior times in history where people felt alienated and felt, lost trust in their institutions and, the positives that can come out of that kind of ferment?
That's a great question. I actually do often, but I would also, one of my mentors, I'll call his name, Arnie Segarra, a really amazing public servant. He wasn't, but he was an advisor to the Young Lords, but he wasn't a Young Lord himself. If you know the Young Lords, they were sort of Puerto Rican, loosely called, and he'd hate me for saying this, but sort of the Puerto Rican version of Black Panthers, based in East Harlem and so on. And he was an advisor to them, and he wound up going into politics and worked for John Lindsay, a former mayor of New York City, and then David Dinkins. And I met him after that. And Arnie always used to tell me that every movement becomes a foundation. And what he meant by that is that what may seem like counterculture at the time eventually becomes the institutions themselves, and eventually the people in those institutions, eventually the people in those movements become part of the institution. And he didn't necessarily mean that meant they somehow sold out. It just meant that the next generation wouldn't see them as the movement anymore. Right? And that's the challenge, that as much as I could talk about what was, They still see me as part of the institution. Why? Because I'm standing in front of the classroom talking to them. I'm part of the institution. What my goal is for my students is to go out and have those experiences themselves, so that they're not just listening to me or reading about it in a text. To go out and experience what it's like to go door to door. Go experience what it's like to go to a subway stop and say, hey, I need you to do this, so this is that, or vote for this person and that person, and have a voter curse you out, right? Because they're just mad at you for whatever, right? Or that candidate or what have you. They need to experience that. So I think one of the things that's always very heartening is that young people want those experiences. What they don't want is for us to stand in the way. And that's what I try to do, is to really give them a path for their own engagement and activism, so that they have that connection, that they know that there's a continuum of this, right? That they're not isolated, going back to that point. So yeah, I try to give them a sense of history, but I encourage them to make their own history.
Well, I think that's actually a very good place to close with that continuum, and with a little bit of, I think, Rooseveltian optimism, in the sense that optimism doesn't mean that one is blind and foolish, but it does actually reflect that we can, that there's some hope out there and we can move forward. And I think that that's possible. And I think that the work, though, has to keep going. That's what we learned. That's the history lesson I always take away, that it doesn't stop. This is the past and the future. It's right, all rolled into one.
Yeah,
I'm going to be that way. I have to be that way.
I know, I understand.
I've got to
I
be
get it.
that
No,
way.
I get it. No, I am.
Help me out here.
I am. Listen, I will tell you, I see it in my parents in many ways. My parents came to this country from Jamaica in 1970. My father worked at a McDonald's on Queens Boulevard, and then he went to a company called the Marcus Knitting Mills. He was a textile worker. My mother taught in the schools in Jamaica, and she came here and had to go back to school at nights to get recertified. So she went to Lehman College at night in the Bronx to get a bachelor's in English and 2 masters in early childhood education and special ed. She taught special ed for 30 years. And there were always books in my house. If I stayed up late to watch a TV show, I had to write a report about it. Who does that? Who does that, right? Who does that? If I went on vacation, I had to write about what I did that day on vacation. And before I could go outside and play, which is interesting, right? Because today, punishment would probably be to go outside. Back in the day, it was to stay inside, right? But in those days, I couldn't go outside unless I did math problems over the summer. I had to do 2 hours worth of math problems before I could go outside. Who does that? Who does that?
Who does that?
My mama does that. And my grandmother lived with us too, and she was also a teacher in Jamaica, and so I had it all day, every day. This is a funny story now, I promise I'll finish it. My mother went to the school's flea market. I was a Catholic school kid, and they used to always raise money through flea markets and missions and such. And she went to the flea market and bought an old desk so that she could bring it home so I could have school at home with a school desk. I'm wonder why I'm not in therapy. But I say that to say, I tell you a story, because what I'm hopeful for is every day, all I want to do is make my parents proud. I want to make sure that the decision they made to come here was not in vain. And of all the things that I've done, my father sees me on Al Jazeera. Do you know Al Jazeera? Mm-hmm. And he's Jamaican, so it's just the global thing. Al Jazeera might as well be maybe BBC, right? Of all the things that I've done, and this was years ago when it was still, they had Al Jazeera America, and he watched me on TV, and I saw him, and he said, He said, "Hey man, I saw you on I saw you on TV." I said, "What?" He said, "Al Jazeera." And I said, "Yeah, I've done that a few times. I've done it." He said, "No man, that's global, man. That's global." And just he lit up because I'm a junior, so my name, his name, and he sees it on the screen, right? And it just gave him this incredible sense of pride. And I guess my point is that they left a situation in Jamaica that politically was fraught, and and eventually was very violent. So when I got into this work, they were really concerned for me, and I said, "Mom, they don't do that here." I said, "Mom, they don't do that here. They don't do that here." And that is what I carry forward in all of this work. It's we don't do that here. This is who we are.
Yeah.
This is why you came. And I try to encourage everyone to live up to the example of every immigrant that's ever come here looking for a better life, or anybody who's grown up here that wanted to see their community better.
I think that is a perfect way to close what is the Sparrow Lecture annually, named after our previous director, who has just written a book that's been published about FDR and Lindbergh in 1940, and how one views the world.
Yes.
And how one connects to it, and whether it looks forward into the best of us, or whether it sees us in limited terms and limiting. And so what you just said, now that's optimistic.
That's optimistic.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Basil.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Oh, what a wonderful way to end. Because I know I can't end on the truly depressing, but